Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Well, technically you're not allowed to say that anymore. Well, I can say it because I'm not German. But the building we're about to see is built around the time when you were allowed to say that. And it's, well, the Tax Museum. I promised I will be going to the Tax Museum, so we're in Hamburg. We're going to watch the Tax Museum, and the problem is that unlike Budapest, here they actually charge you shekels, so it's not enough that they already steal through taxation from you, but then you have to also pay extra shekels to see how they steal the shekels from you and how they used to steal their shekels from you back in the Middle Ages and all the way till the present day. So yeah, I guess let's pay them shekels and let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first featured installment of the 2019 German tour. We'll start with the eccentric promise made back in the winter, namely to show you Das Deutsche Zollmuseum, or the German Customs Museum, part of the same network of museums as the Budapest Taxation Museum, shown in February. Generally, there are three reasons, usually interwoven with each other, for which one goes to a museum. 1. To learn new things. 2. To have fun. This would be the case of the Miniaturwunderland Museum located nearby this one. And 3. To learn and/or understand the direction of the propaganda of a particular state. This particular museum is a great example of the third reason, as it shows how the state is struggling with promoting the new propaganda whilst staying consistent with the narrative of the past. A few days later, I was going to learn the hard way that most state-owned museums struggle with the same issue, but more on that in another video. Before I stepped foot into this museum, I taped the intro that you've just seen, in which I uttered the now highly haram phrase Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, because I was expecting an exhibition that would glorify the rigorous institutionalized theft, otherwise known as the taxation system, that Germany or the German states have had throughout the years. Well, not so fast. On one hand, we can find a lot of material inside the museum about how the business of taxation evolved in the German states throughout the time, but on the other hand, we also have a lot of moralizing claptrap. You see, in the Budapest Taxation Museum, things were pretty straightforward. These were the tools, these were the uniforms, these were the laws, the state wanted money, end of story. Very honest and free of charge, because you already paid for it through your nose. In Das Deutsche Zollmuseum, however, you get an endless stream of sob-stories on how you're literally killing people if you bring cigarettes from Poland instead of buying the enormously overtaxed ones in the German stores in order to feed the gigantic and utterly unsustainable welfare state. And it doesn't stop there either. You get a lecture on how fair it is to have as much money as possible squeezed from you. And yes, the word fairness means the same thing in German. You see, it's all for fairness, so wanting not to be stolen from is, well, unfair. Although the museum is called Zoll Museum, Zoll being basically the word for customs duty, the museum is a full-fledged taxation museum because it defends all forms of theft, income tax, VAT, and the social whatever, which is basically the stupidity tax that most Europeans pay under the promise that the state will take care of them when they're old. Spoiler alert, it won't happen. Now, all of this wouldn't be such a bad thing if it weren't for the whole Euro crap superimposed on the prevalent narrative. One can even see in the museum how the propagandists struggled to maintain consistency while having to defend the huge national taxation system, while also having to praise the customs union, otherwise known as the European Union, and open borders in general, which exist purportedly to eliminate custom duties. Well, that's the theory. In practice, of course, all those employees of the Bundeszollverwaltung, with their cushy jobs and guaranteed salaries, all financed by the tax-paying sucker, didn't just go away with the European Union. In fact, their powers have been increased. While when borders were a thing, the customs police could only harass you in the border area, now they can harass you whenever and wherever they feel like it. And you see, that's progress. Their powers have also increased now that Zoll Authority is also concerned with the so-called under-the-table work, or black work, and even with more esoteric things like tracking environmental crimes, according to the public display at the entrance of the museum, which now has the slogan, "A mission without borders." So the customs office, an office inherently related to, well, borders, has a mission without borders. I would say it's kind of Orwellian, but out of the over 2 weeks spent in Germany, this museum provided to be the least Orwellian experience for sure.
War in the Ukraine, another slice of eternity.
Things get slightly better once you go where few visitors go, namely upstairs, where the exhibition goes a bit further back in time. One huge downside of this museum is that it doesn't have nowhere near enough information about the customs duties in the former DDR, or East Germany, or at least a superficial comparison between the customs system in the DDR and the one of the Bonn Republic. That is quite a pity, because the DDR Museum in Berlin doesn't have that kind of information either, as that one is more focused on the communist propaganda. In contrast, though, the exhibition goes quite into details about customs duty collection even in the colonies. Here is where one can admire the plaque of Zollabfertigungsstelle Windhoek, which was the customs clearance agency in Windhoek, at the time part of the German Empire and today, of course, the capital city of the Republic of Namibia. One day I'll show you Windhoek too, I promise. The most German part of this museum is the portion where you're shown just how much care the First Reich in particular took in order to make sure they squeeze every last shekel in customs duties. Not only did they use scales, but had multiple ways of checking the merge for contraband, including, if you can believe that, for salt. To make sure not only that what you said is salt is indeed salt, but it's also the salt from the place written on the papers. So yeah, the Zoll in Germany has always been quite salty. Then to top it all off, the museum, besides asking for money to get into it, also asks for donations. And it appears there have indeed been some takers too. Again, this is a common practice in many museums, particularly the private ones, but given that it's a museum dedicated to taxation, it is quite a spit in the face to ask for both an entrance fee and a donation at the end of the tour. That's just rude. But one can easily forgive that once one gets to the freebie part of this complex, namely the outside area, which ironically has more interesting stuff. First of all, the canal that runs in front of the building is literally called Der Zollkanal, an artificially built canal built in 1888 in order to bypass the newly created free port area. Essentially, they built an artificial river just so they can charge more customs toll. This is quite funny, in a German way. The history of the Zollkanal is particularly interesting because it resembles what Berlin and Germany in general is now doing incrementally to all of Europe. The story goes like this. Hamburg was always an independent-minded city. With that said, the independent and sovereign city of Hamburg joins in 1815 the German Confederation but does not become a member of the German Customs Union. Another war happens, namely the Austro-Prussian one, and eventually Hamburg is forced to join the North German Federation, but even then, the city negotiates an opt-out for itself, which translated in Article 34 of the North German Constitution, which stated that Hamburg and the other Hanseatic cities would remain as free ports outside the community customs border until they apply for inclusion. Now that sounds familiar? That Article 34 did survive to the creation of the First Reich, or the German Empire, in 1871, when the South German states also joined the EU. I mean, the German Federation. Nevertheless, Berlin didn't give up, and by 1879 it slaps the Hanseatic city with enormous tariffs in order to force the hand of those pesky independent-minded peeps to reconsider their defiance to the great project. So, in 1881, an agreement is signed, but even then, in the agreement, a permanent free port district is still negotiated for which Article 34 would still apply, and the freedoms of that district could not be abolished or restricted if the Hamburg government didn't approve. So that's how the area known to this day as a Speicherstadt, or the warehouse district, was born. And at the end of it was the Zollkanal, which served as a Zollkanal and thus as a border all the way up until 2013. The political struggle is still on, as Hamburg still does retain the privilege of having an area in the port that is foreign custom. It's just that it's not this area anymore, as this one has slowly become a tourist attraction and the home of this particular museum, but also of the Miniatur Wunderland, the Hamburg Dungeon, a few cafes, or the International Maritime Museum. The whole area is under redevelopment, so in the future it would replace the shekels lost by not being a Zoll area with shekels from tourists. So it's good that I got to see it and you get to see it too, before it becomes a brutalist area. To give you a sample of what the planners have in mind, this is the Elbe Philharmonic Hall, located just a few hundred meters away. The taxpayer paid about 870 million euros for this thing. Kinda terrible if you ask me. Though one does get a very nice view from the top of it, so there's that. Anyway, back to the Zoll Museum. The old bridge that connected the free area with the city has at its end these nice NPCs to show us how in the past you would be stopped by the literal toll patrol to ask if you got a license to be there. It's too bad one is not allowed inside, so I could get a much better picture of these NPCs and maybe even get the chance to LARP as a customs officer. After all, in the DDR museum, they do let you LARP as a Kobe party official or as a Trabant driver. So why not here? In any event, just as one goes past the Zoll point, the old block of the customs collection is still there, and then one can descend upon the decommissioned Oldenburg, a customs cutter sitting on the Zoll Canal, which can be visited for free. The Oldenburg is not a customs cutter from Hamburg, but from Bremen, as the old man on board informs us. Too bad my German is terrible, because he probably worked on one of these and could have provided a lot more information than the museum itself. The Oldenburg was, in its heyday, one of the top-tier boats that the Zoll authority had, because it could also go into the sea, and it is basically a high-speed light ship meant to approach any boat that is in the guarded waters without having paid the Zoll, basically. Nevertheless, the boat, which is an adjacent to the museum, is certainly more attractive to visit than the museum itself. At least you learn that the employees of the past tax authority had to live on limited means while doing the dirty work of collecting taxes. Ultimately, being a port city does help in the Department of Customs Museums. Getting to see this boat and the literal NPCs at the entrance almost makes one forget the rest of the museum, while the ones not located in a big port have to work harder on their customs museum. So, this concludes the second customs museum in the International Association of Customs Museums, which has 23 member countries. The USA, the UK, Slovakia, Malta, China, Czechia, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Italy don't have such museums though, even though they are member states in this international association. So with those off the list, and also Hungary and Germany now off the list, we still have 11 more customs museums to visit. Now, with China, Finland, and Iceland off the list, it shouldn't be that hard. We'll get to all of them by 2026 or so. Perhaps even earlier if the shekels will allow it, and it would if not for those pesky taxes. I mean, it really is a vicious circle. We can't see the customs museums because we can't afford it, and we can't afford it because of the taxes and customs. Anyway, this was the video on Das Deutsche Zollmuseum because I really find it intriguing to have the audacity to open a museum in which to glorify the institutionalized theft. That's something that regular thieves and gangsters couldn't afford, even if for PR reasons. The closest to this got Pablo Escobar, which had a museum dedicated to his life and activity, but the main gangster, the state, could not allow that to happen and the museum got shut down. The reason? The museum didn't have a paid license to exist. You see, all the museums dedicated to gangsta theft need a license from the main enforcer of theft. And for some reason, this makes perfect sense to enough people. Oh well, it is what it is. So with that said, many thanks to Scheiss Squad for providing the soundtrack and also for the help provided during the Hamburg part of the Germany tour. Check out their work, links are in the description, and keep in mind that taxation is aggravated and repeated first-degree armed robbery. So with that, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, none of this would be possible without it. Visit our website freedomalternative.com and consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. From Hamburg, over and out.